Good day to you, and I hope you are well. In this session, we are going to be considering appropriate images and metaphors for ministry. And this is part of our ongoing conversation about ministerial ethics. You know, as human beings, images and metaphors play an important role in shaping the way we look at the world and our place in it. And although there are technical distinctions between metaphors and images, today I'm using them interchangeably. And my thoughts here are based on the following assumption. Unless we change people's image of the world and their place in it, it's quite unlikely that we will change their opinions and behaviors. That applies to others, and it applies to ourselves. Unless we change people's image of the world and their place in it, it's quite unlikely that we will change their opinions and behaviors. All the facts and all the arguments in the world may bring about intellectual agreement, but unless we actually impact someone's worldview, there's precious little chance for lasting change. Unless people see themselves differently, they will revert to ingrained patterns of behavior, of viewpoint, and action. Why is that? Well, the simplest answer is because up to now, those patterns have worked for them. They've gotten them this far. And we could argue about whether or not those patterns have worked well, whether they've been healthy or just or whatever, but in the opinion of the person, chances are that they have helped to make some sense of the world. So here's a key point. Human beings strive to avoid cognitive dissonance. A healthy person will do almost anything to achieve coherence between their perception of the world and their place in it, and their experience of reality. Coherence between their perception of the world and their place in it, and their experience of reality. In other words, it's a crucial function of human psychology to maintain a meaningful connection between how they perceive the world and how they experience it. That's how we make sense of life. Cognitive dissonance is the misalignment of the two factors, and if extreme enough, it will lead to a change in one or the other in a healthy person. Put another way, if what we know about the world conflicts with our experience of the world, and the conflict is strong enough, one or the other will change. Let me give you an example. Consider the person who smokes and who decides to stop. This might be you or it might be somebody else. You might ask the person, why did they start smoking? Chances are you'll discover that they had a reason to start smoking that they considered good, and they can answer yes to the next two questions. Are they aware of the medical reasons that they should not smoke? And have they been confronted by any societal disfavor as a smoker? Chances are the answer to both questions is yes. They probably know of the medical evidence of the harm of smoking, and they've probably been on the receiving end of some disfavor. Cognitive dissonance is beginning to develop for them. And then we ask the question, well, why do you still smoke? If someone is still smoking, chances are that their answer will indicate that smoking works for them at some level. This allows them to continue in the activity. It doesn't matter whether you or I consider those benefits worthwhile. They do. What they are receiving outweighs the challenges or the opposition or the warnings. Now, at some point, the balance of reasons will continue versus reasons to cease may change. At that point, they will experience a growing cognitive dissonance. A struggle will take place between what they believe about themselves and what's right on the one hand and how they are acting on the other. And then they may be ready to undertake the very difficult shift in behavior to overcome the dissonance. So, what does all that have to do with ministry? The focus is on images, our images of ourselves and of others. And those images shape our self-understanding and how we view the world. And if we're going to establish a healthy and functioning ministerial ethics, we have to balance a variety of factors. Most healthy people do not routinely act in a way that violates their self-understanding. Similarly, if our self-understanding is healthy and consistent with the values we espouse, then we're on the way to grounding truly ethical professional behavior that is simply second nature. That's one of the goals of the course, is to help you develop a professional ethical framework which operates so effectively that you're not really conscious of its service to you. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to pause the recording and do the following. First of all, jot down some images or metaphors for ministers, positive or negative, things like shepherd, pastor, leader, and so on. And then reflect for a minute. Where do you think these images or metaphors are most expressed in ministry? Which ones do you find the most congenial, and why are they so for you? Which ones do you find the most difficult, and why? What would be the shadow side of the positive ones you've identified? Pause the recording now and do that reflecting. Welcome back. I hope that reflection was profitable for you. How does this influence your ministerial practice? Well, for one thing, it has to do with the power of your office. You must come to terms with the power of your office if you're going to function in ministry. Power exists whether you like it or I like it or not. There are times when I absolutely hate it, particularly when what I take are negative judgments being made about me. And often those judgments are rendered by folk who have no real experience of ministry beyond Hollywood or TV, or I'm automatically lumped in with the religious right, or I'm one of those people. To a certain extent, that's probably true of all occupations. You know the lines. All lawyers are shysters, all doctors are quacks, and plumbers and mechanics are just out to stiff the unknowing public. You know the drill. But to a different extent, clergy really are what we do. We're talking about the office of the minister. And I'm not talking about the room in which you do your work. I'm talking about the role, the place, the position, the office of ministers. Some of the most unintentionally destructive acts I've ever witnessed in congregations occurred when clergy forgot who they were. And obviously, on the other side, there are lots of examples of clergy using the office to manipulate people. But in the cases I'm thinking of, the clergy in question believed that by denying the reality of the power of the office, they were actually setting aside that power. I can think of a case from a couple of decades ago in another province where the minister was leaving. He was having to retire for health reasons, and he was quite bitter about that. And what he said to the congregation in a number of meetings was, well, I don't really have any more authority here than you, and I really don't know anything more than you, so this is just my opinion. While his opinions happened to be about next steps for the congregations, and because the congregation followed his next step, a series of years of controversy and problems followed on that. Now, another way to think about this is to consider Jungian archetypes. You know that Carl Jung, in his psychology, has a variety of figures who act as archetypes in the human drama, the human story. There's the hero, and there's the crone, and so on. If we think about archetypes, it helps us to comprehend the power of the resident holy person. And that's quite apart from any individual characteristics you or I may have. For instance, Every elder on the session may visit someone in the hospital, but until I, the minister, go, the patient and the family may say, well, the church hasn't visited. So what's going on there? Many of our elders may be far more empathetic and caring and faithful people than I ever will be. But it's not about me, it's the office. And on the negative side, I can often get people who may have refused every approach by the nominating committee to take on a task. I know that and struggle with it, and some would say that's why more didn't get done around the congregations that I served, because I wasn't exercising my role as motivator and recruiter in an appropriate fashion. I can live with that. There is power in the office for good or ill, but the power is there and you need to take account of it, which relates to ministerial ethics. If we're going to develop a credible professional ethic, we need to be aware of our own points of neediness. We all have needs. No human being is without them. But congregations are not given into our charge for the purpose of working out our needs. Just keep that in mind. Why are you doing what you are doing? What of your buttons are being pushed? Is what you are doing truly faithful? Again, I'm going to pose a question and ask you to pause the recording and reflect and maybe write about it. This time, my question is about the image of the wounded healer. Do you recognize that image? What meaning does it convey to you? Can you see yourself as a wounded healer? So pause the recording and reflect on that, please. Here's how I understand that image of the wounded healer, and I choose that one because it's one that occurs fairly frequently in theological education and conversations about the role of ministers. It recognizes that everyone is carrying wounds of some sort or another. In this context, we're primarily thinking of psychological or spiritual wounds, although I'm not ruling out physical roots. It could be argued that those wounds are part of our motivation or compulsion, vocation, or calling that draws the healer into the service of others. Something happened to them, and it developed within them. It called forth from them something which responded to the sense of that happening in others and their desire to be of assistance or service in some way. So what's the difference between someone who is wounded, which is all of us, and a wounded healer? The key difference is that the healer has taken the time and the effort to understand their wounds. The healer has taken the time and made the effort to understand their wounds. This is neither a quick nor an easy process. It requires going all the way into the pain and the darkness that left that wound. And when we've done that, then our wound becomes a resource or a tool to aid in the healing of others. But if our wounds are simply there, raw and red, they don't help us or anyone else. Now, there's a certain value to empathy, shared feeling and experience, but as a professional in ministry, it's important to understand our wounds in order that they be a resource to others. Second, and perhaps as important, is to recognize that the wounds we have not addressed that can be triggered by other people's stuff. Can you recognize the wounds that you have not addressed but which can be triggered by other people's stuff? Even the most balanced of us will not have addressed every wound, and that's okay. What's crucial is knowing our own triggers, knowing the buttons that people can push. That's an important part of behaving ethically, practicing ministry ethically. So, again, I want you to pause the recording and I want you to think about the wounded healer images. What are the downsides or the danger sides of the wounded healer as a metaphor for misery? What wounds are you carrying that will impact your ministerial practice for good or for ill. Pause and reflect on that. Pause the video. When we reflect on our own wounds as people, it leads us quite naturally to a discussion of vulnerability, and like many powerful realities, vulnerability can be both appropriate and inappropriate. Often determining that may depend upon the context and with whom we are being vulnerable. There's the question of appropriate self-revelation. Appropriate self-revelation or sharing is an ethical decision. I need to ask the question, why am I sharing this particular part of my life with this person or this group of people at this time? Are my reasons for doing so ethically sound and honorable? Or am I trying to get something else to happen? Let's consider the story behind the image of the wounded healer. It makes very clear that proper public vulnerability in worship, in a meeting, in a study session, or the like, it applies to issues that we have resolved rather than current crises. So when I'm in the midst of some form of crisis, that is not the most appropriate time to be revealing details which may resolve themselves in ways I cannot now imagine. I'm sure any of us who have lived any length of time have been into situations that in the midst of them we could not imagine how this thing was going to come to some sort of solution. And we are quite surprised at the end, those things which were critical to the solution and those things which seemed to be so large at the time, which ended up feeling quite tangential. So we deal with our crises appropriately for ourselves. We don't use them as ways of being vulnerable. And awareness of our woundedness can be a two-edged sword. It can lead us to insight or empathy. It can lead us to arrogantly declare, "Oh, I know just what you're feeling." Have you ever had anybody say that to you? Chances are it was meant empathetically, but the way it was received is often a way that shuts down the other person's experience, absorbing it entirely into our own, devaluing their experience, making it simply a reflection of our own experience. So, ethically, what can we do or say? Well, first of all, we treat every person as a unique child of God rather than as the latest representative of a particular situation. They're not a statistic, they are an individual. We can also talk about what I feel. Let me give you a very personal example. When I was 35 years old and 2 weeks before the birth of my second daughter, I had open heart surgery on an emergency basis. I had one valve replaced and one valve repaired, and given the nature of the situation, we were warned that there was a significant possibility of my not surviving without significant impact or not surviving at all. So, as you can imagine, that is something that I carry with me. So, when I go and visit someone on the cardiac ward, I twitch a little bit anyway. After listening, I can talk about my own reaction to my own open heart surgery, about the recovery, and so on. It's not for a moment implying my parishioner needs to react in a similar fashion. It's saying that we have had a similar experience. Here's what I felt. Tell me what you feel, because my response is not your response. Let's think for a moment about the significance of the term professional as applied to ministry. It's relevant because formalized ethical codes and ethical standards are widely applied to people in professions. So there is an implication that those who advocate for ethical standards for ministers see ministry, at least in part, as a profession. So I invite you to ponder your feelings about that. When ministry is called a profession, what does that mean to you? What are some of the upsides and downsides of viewing ministry as a profession? Does the image empower you or trouble you? You may want to pause the recording and jot down your responses. It's important to notice how our relationship to language and to our experience can affect the impact of an image. My experience and perception of professional is positive. When I hear the term professional, I think of someone who has worked to master a specific body of knowledge, who has been deemed to have attained a certain minimal standard of expertise, who is committed to a certain high code of achievement and conduct, and to the regular disciplines of improving and upgrading. On the other hand, I know that some people, perhaps because of their experiences, wrestle with the term. They feel that it implies a dispassionate, arm's-length relationship to others, sometimes called clients, which is at odds with some aspects of the vocational call to ministry. Would you agree with that or not? I would like to think that honesty in communication is part of our ministerial ethic. Language becomes critically important in a case like this, as our recognition of language is never neutral. It's always freighted with meanings. In this case, certain characteristics are identified by some clergy labeled professional. Much of the behavior condemned as professional is not professional at all, in my estimation. It is simply undisciplined and self-serving in a way that would never be accepted in most professional circles. Let me give you an example, a really bad example, again from decades ago, and this happens to come from a different Christian tradition. But there was a ministerial student, who was serving an internship, and the supervisor had gone away and left the student caring for the pastoral charge. As it happened, the wife of a senior leader in the congregation passed away quite suddenly on a Friday afternoon. When contacted about it, the student's response, thinking it was professional, was to say, "Well, I'm sorry, I've worked my hours for the week, and they'll just have to wait until Monday." That was a distorted vision of what it means to be professional. You'll have opportunity to wrestle with that as we read the United Church's ethical and professional standard statements. As we move into the new configuration of the church and changed lines of accountability, we need to get some wider clarity about what discipline in the church really means. We also need clarity about how that authority can be justly exercised. The ethical guidelines and the professional standards are an attempt to articulate a shared set of standards to which we can hold one another accountable. The difficulty with many of those who oppose the term professional in relationship to ministry is that the opinion often seems to arise from the presumption that there was a time when everyone just knew. Maybe it was in the baptismal water. Everyone just knew how ministers were supposed to act. There are so many problems with that assumption that it makes my head ache. But see what you think about it. What do you think about those ethical standards? How do they impact and how do they conflict with or cohere with your understanding of what it means to be in ministry? I look forward to our conversation. Thanks.